Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Sam Peck. I'm the Executive Director of Family Councils of Ontario, and it is my sincere and extreme pleasure to welcome you to today's session of our June 2022 virtual conference, Regroup, Refocus, Recharge. We have so much to celebrate this month. It's Seniors Month, it is National Indigenous History Month. This week is Family Council Week, and it's also Pride Month, which today's session will speak to the real importance of inclusive communities and welcoming folks from the LGBTQ2S A plus community. I am really grateful to be able to learn about these important celebrations and observances. Before we go further and I turn it over to my colleague, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land I'm coming to you from. I'm based in Hamilton, and it's situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. FCO was actually founded in Toronto, which is traditional territories of similar nations. Some of them are the same: the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabeg, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's still home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As a remote team, we encourage our team members, our service users, and our partners to reflect on colonialism, what it continues to mean. For long-term care homes, you may have folks who lived through the 60s scoop. You may have people whose communities are continuing to find unmarked graves at residential schools. So think about things like that and how you can engage in meaningful reconciliation. There's a wonderful website that's native-land.ca. Type in your address, and you can learn more about the territory that you're coming to us from. The work that non-Indigenous organizations and individuals need to do towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is a long-term journey. It's specific to each organization, and it's continually evolving for us as well, as individuals and an organization. And we welcome you to join us on our journey. I'm now going to hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Leah.
Hi, thank you, Sam. My name is Leah Cabral. I'm the Communications Manager at FCO. To mark Seniors Month and Family Council Week, we're holding a series of education and networking sessions all month. And next week, we're holding our one-day conference event, our Day of Learning, featuring 3 guest speakers, structured networking opportunities, and lots of opportunities to connect with family council members and long-term care leaders across Ontario. We invite you to join us for these incredible learning and networking sessions. Today is made possible because of our friends, specifically our monthly donors, the Friends of FCO. Your monthly commitment enables us to plan ahead and create special events and projects just like this virtual conference. We extend our deepest gratitude to our friends. We couldn't do it without you. If you'd like to know more about the Friends of FCO monthly giving program, please visit our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest speakers, Dr. Shari Brotman and Julien Rougerie, for their presentation, Intentionally Inviting and Inclusive Long-Term Care Homes for LGBTQ plus residents and their chosen families. Why are they needed and how can we create them? In this session, we will explore the experiences of long-term care homes among LGBTQ plus residents and their chosen families, and suggest avenues for creating more intentionally inviting and inclusive spaces. Shari is an associate professor at the McGill School of Social Work and a member of the Center for Research and Expertise on Social Gerontology. Shari has worked as an educator, researcher, and practitioner in the fields of social gerontology and anti-oppressive social work practice. Julien joined Fondation Emergence in April 2017 to run the Aging Gayfully program, dedicated to raising awareness about sexual and gender diversity in senior settings. Part of his job includes giving training sessions to workers, offering services to seniors in order to help them create more welcoming environments to LGBTQ plus seniors. Please invite me in welcoming Dr. Brotman and Julien Rougerie.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful introduction. And it's great to be here. I think the Family Councils of Ontario do amazing work and have such an important role in long-term care homes. And Julien and I are really pleased to be able to share our knowledge with you today and to open up a conversation about how we provide intentionally inclusive and welcoming environments in long-term care for LGBTQ plus residents and their chosen families. So I guess we can, Julien, should we start the slideshow?
Yep.
So Julien, no, maybe stay on that slide just for a second so you could share with us where those pictures come from.
Oh, yeah. So those pictures are actually part of the Aging Gay Fully program. And it's actual LGBTQ plus seniors who were volunteered to accept that we photograph them, because LGBTQI plus seniors are very invisible. And that's actually true in photo banks, photo stocks, where you won't find a couple of older women, for example. So we decided to make our own photograph and image to make them more visible.
Thank you. So Leah already did the introduction and what organizations that we represent, but just to say really briefly that I'm involved. One of the things that's exciting about Julien and I presenting together is that we really bring together the perspectives of research and practice. And together, we have both been involved in a role of education to the health and social care system, and including residential care and home care. So as Leah mentioned, I've been involved in research on LGBTQ plus older people for the past 25 years or so, both through the university as well as through the Center for Research and Expertise in Social Gerontology.
And as for Fondation Emergence, we are an LGBTQI plus nonprofit based in Montreal. We're mostly known for originating the International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia of May 17th. And another program that we have is the Aging Gay Fully program, dedicated to raising awareness in senior settings about gender and sexual diversity. And the Aging Gay Fully program is 13 years old this year, so it's been running for quite a while now.
Yeah, and although we're both situated in Quebec, we have a lot of experience in research and education across the country. Julien has presented in places all across the country, and myself, my research has been local but also national. So we will, bring in the context of Ontario as we speak, but just to keep in mind that what we're presenting on has an impact on all LGBTQ plus people and their chosen families across the country. Okay, next slide. So this is our presentation outline. We'll be talking a little bit about who are LGBTQ plus people and their chosen families. We'll talk about what social exclusion, discrimination, and intolerance look like in the context of long-term care. We'll speak a little bit about the Canadian landscape of long-term care inclusivity for LGBTQ plus people. I've been involved in a project that looked at issues of inclusivity in long-term care homes in Canada that was led by Dr. Tamara Sussman. So I'll speak a little bit about those findings, and then we'll address what best practices and policies can we advocate for in order to change things for the better for residents and their chosen families. And finally, we'll have a chance for questions and responses and discussion. So, who are LGBTQ plus residents and their chosen families? Julien.
So thank you, Shari. So maybe a good way to introduce who are LGBTQ plus residents and their chosen families. Maybe we can give you a as short as possible, definition of what is sexual and gender diversity, also known as 2S LGBTQI plus communities. So we don't have much time today, so maybe a good way to define those minorities, this diversity, is it's composed of all diversity on the sexual romantic orientation spectrum, as well as the diversity in gender expression and gender identity, as well as diversity on based on biological sex. So for your sexual/romantic orientation, you are part of sexual and gender diversity if you are not heterosexual. So if you're a homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, and so that's commonly known. As for gender expression and gender identity, the difference between the two is gender expression is how you express the gender you identify to. So it can be whether feminine, whether masculine, or in between. It's really important to keep in mind that we have a spectrum with two options, but there's a lot of room for everyone between those two options. When we usually tend to have a very binary vision where it's all homo or hetero, feminine, masculine, boy, girl, etc. It's important to keep in mind that there's room in between all of those options. So gender expression is how you express your gender, for example, how you get dressed. And gender identity is more something that happens within your head, if I may say. You start having a gender identity around the age of 3. It's how you identify on the gender scale, whether you identify as a male, as a female, or you identify in a gender in between, or you don't identify to a gender at all, such as non-binary people. Non-binary people either identify in between the two dominating gender, or they don't identify to any particular gender at all. So you are part of sexual and gender diversity if your gender expression and your gender identity is not going to align on your sex assigned at birth, which is the case of people who are trans. People who are trans do not identify to the sex that was assigned to them at birth. So we're talking about sex assigned at birth here, and there's also diversity on the biological field, because we tend to think that biologically people are either male or female. Well, that's not quite true, because almost 2% of the world population is intersex. People who are intersex are biologically in between the male and female sex. So that's also part, intersex people are also part of the sexual and gender diversity. So when we talk about those minorities, we're talking about all those forms of diversity on those 4 main components. So we could discuss about this for hours. I love this topic, but we have to move on now to the definition, or what is the chosen family and who are the caregivers.
Thanks, Julien. And we'll be talking a little bit more about these questions of language, what language is appropriate to use, how we identify people, a little bit later on when we talk about good practices for inclusion. So on this slide, we have 2 definitions up. I'll talk to the bottom one first, which is the definition of caregiver. We've used the definition that is in the new law in Quebec, which addresses caregivers specifically, and the rights and responsibilities of the healthcare system toward caregivers. And I'll read it out to you. Any person who, in a continuous or occasional way, provides significant unpaid and volunteer support to someone close to them with temporary or permanent disability, and with which they share an emotional bond, whether family related or not. And we underline the whether family related or not because this is an important point for inclusion, creating inclusive environments. Because a lot of times in our system, we assume family to be biological, connected by birth. And we know now, and most definitions of caregiving and caregiver associations call attention to the friends and family as caregiver, but our systems are not as quick to catch up. So when we think of, for example, in defining who can belong to a family council, for example, we often prioritize and advertise to biological families, and typically spouses and children. And in the LGBTQ plus community, this idea of chosen family has really been put forward and been very important to push against this idea about biological or nuclear relationships as counting as families. So chosen family is like family. It's the networks of people who consider themselves like family, but who may fall outside this normative, what we call hetero-cis nuclear, this nuclear family structure made up of, a father and a mother and their children. Chosen family can include extended kin, close friends, but also community members who are present and provide unpaid care and support in a continuous or occasional way. And one of the things that we think is really important when we talk about older LGBTQ plus people, we often talk about social isolation. We see this as a community that is particularly socially isolated, disconnected. And to an extent, that's true, because there are people who are disconnected from their families of origin because they were not accepted for their sexual and gender identities. And also, there's a higher proportion of older LGBTQ plus people who live alone. But we have to be careful also, because LGBTQ plus people also, if we think about chosen families, may have a larger and stronger support system, particularly from the community, where collective action and support to protect community members against discrimination has been put in place over many, many, many years, so that in response to hostile environments, the community may come in to act as a caregiver to an older person, and they may not be close friends and they may not be related, but are still actively involved and have a voice in the care of an older person. So we have to kind of rethink how we think about family and who gets included in family in our definitions in long-term care. Thanks. Next slide. Unless you want to say something about that, Julien, please go ahead.
No, I'll just tag along with the next slide. Shari was saying that there's a lot of isolation within the older 2S LGBTQI population. And it's also a population that is very, very invisible in senior settings, in health services, and, in services that we offer to seniors. And yet it's about 10% of the population. Same thing, for younger generations. There's no reason why it would be different with seniors, but the 10% is here, but it's they're very, very invisible. And they're very invisible because of stigma and discrimination that they experience over their life course. They experience a time where the social stigma was really, really high. It was encouraged and present in every levels of society, your family, your friends, your coworkers. It was pretty much impossible to be openly LGBTQI plus not that long ago. Discrimination and stigma on the religious level too. It's really important to take into consideration that Canada not that long ago was much more religious than it is now. So people were in very religious and conservative backgrounds, and most religions consider sexual and gender diversity as a sin. So it was really tricky for members of the LGBTQI plus communities back then to accept themselves and, declare themselves as LGBTQI plus. On the medical field, of course, it was considered a disease by the DSM up until 1973. I'm talking about homosexuality here. As for trans identity, it was considered a disease by the DSM up until 2013. So that's extremely recent that we don't consider queer people to be suffering from a mental disease that has to be cured. And last but not least, it was also illegal not that long ago to be a queer person in Canada. Actually, homosexual activities were decriminalized in 1969. So if you were born in the 40s, in 1940, which means you're going to turn 82 this year, if my math is right. So you were 29 years old when loving who you were loving was a crime punishable with imprisonment. So of course, back in the day, like queer people had no choice but to engage in a heterosexual wedding and have children. There was almost no other way around to live as a queer person. The same person was 33 years old when being homosexual was not considered a disease anymore in North America. In Canada, you could lose your apartment, you could lose your job because you were homosexual, or you could be refused services for the same reason up until 1996. So the person was 56 years old. So that gives you a picture of what the life course of the person was. It was a federal law of 1996, and actually the federal government was really proactive in hunting and detecting whoever was queer within their employees to fire them. Maybe you've heard of the purge and the fruit machine. We don't have the time to talk about that right now, but it's easy to do a Google search about that. So that's up until 1996 in Canada. Same-sex marriage was allowed in 2005. So the person was 65 years old. It's never too late to get married, of course, but it's an option like that is coming up pretty late in your life. And for trans people, trans identity was not considered a disease anymore in North America, only in 2013. So the person was 73 years old when the health sector was not considering them as someone suffering from a mental disease and someone that needs to be cured. And last, the federal law prohibits discrimination against trans people for the past 6 years only. So if you were born in 1940 and you are a trans person, it was better to hide it up until the age of 76 years old. Otherwise, you could be legally discriminated because you were a trans person. And now maybe just a few words about LGBTQ plus caregivers' realities. Well, first of all, it's the realities that everybody is facing as a caregiver. When you're a caregiver, it requires a lot of self-giving. Some people even talk about a sacrifice. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of energy. You always have to manage, a feeling of guilt. Are you doing enough? Are you doing too much, and you're going to go through a burnout and you're going to have to stop helping the person. And when you're a caregiver, that can last a few years, but that can also last a few decades, 10 or 10 years or 20 years. And since it's kind of a full-time job, you can quickly become socially isolated because you dedicate all of your time to the person you are helping. So that's valid for every unpaid caregivers. But when you are LGBTQI+, it's going to multiply or add up to these realities, since you and the person you're helping experience rejection by society in general, by their family. Sometimes you reject yourself as a queer person, so that's really hard to manage. And when you've had experience of rejection, it's going to have consequences on your social isolation, because it's harder to communicate with people. It's harder to engage and ask for services and for help. It's going to have an impact as well on their mental health. and a constant fear of disclosing. Can I say that I'm a queer person? Will I feel comfortable being openly gay, lesbian, bi, or trans if I go using these services? Or is the person I'm helping is going to feel safe coming out as a queer person? So being LGBTQ plus is definitely going to multiply the challenges of being a caregiver. Just a few additional challenges. When you're queer and an unpaid caregiver, it's going to be tricky to self-identify because LGBTQI plus caregivers are often invisible, and when we do represent them, it's always within heteronormative norms. A wife taking care of the husband, the children taking care of their parents. And as Shari said, for queer unpaid caregivers, they tend more often to help their friends rather than their families. They have an increased risk of burnout that we quickly mentioned before. This can be explained by the fact that they don't self-identify, and when you don't self-identify, you're not going to obtain the services that do exist for unpaid caregiver. And the risk of burnout is also explained by the constant fear of disclosing that you or the person you're helping is LGBTQI plus. And last, they can be solicited on two fronts because, yes, they help their chosen families, but they can also be solicited by their family of origin to whom they might not be fully out, which can be an additional layer of complexity. So they have obstacle to access health and social care services or any other kind of help because they don't self-identify and they tend to be more isolated than the average of unpaid caregivers.
Who's reading that? Is that me? Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It's me. So just to add a couple things before I read the quote to you. The first thing I want to mention again relates to language because I know that we used and presented LGBTQ plus in our presentation, but Julien has switched to queer or homosexual even sometimes, and I just want to put that in context for you now. But we can discuss how do we manage all this language when we speak about good practices. We don't in English for sure use the term homosexual to identify a person anymore. But when we speak about the history and the laws, we invariably have to use that term because the laws were created using that language. That language to identify a person is now considered derogatory. So we would identify a person as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, for example, and not through the term homosexual. Queer, we sometimes, those of us in advocacy and within the community use that term. It's an umbrella term that encompasses the whole diversity that Julien was speaking about in that slide of definitions. And, it could be challenging sometimes with all the different names and labels that people use in a presentation. So sometimes we use the word queer just as an umbrella term. Again, it's not language that older people specifically are necessarily comfortable with or use for themselves. It was developed more as an umbrella term amongst a younger generation. So in my own research with older people, they would very, very rarely, unless they were really a strong activist in the community themselves and today, would use that term, that identity label for themselves. But we're going to switch in and out of these labels as we go through the presentation, but we can definitely clarify what to do with this when we're meeting people or working with people. So I'm just going to read you one quote from my research that goes like this. It's from a coordinator of a caregiver organization who told us, "I've been working with caregivers for the past 12 years and never have we stopped to think about gays and lesbians. No one has ever told us that their experiences could be different or that they needed something. Never." And I think that this is a good quote to explain what Julien was speaking about, which is that people really remain hidden. And it's our responsibility to create an environment in which they feel accepted and included. Otherwise, people are not going to come out and tell you, and therefore they are not going to participate. Okay, that's that. Next slide, please. So what does social exclusion, discrimination, and intolerance look like in the context of long-term care? And here I'm presenting the first part of actually a continuum, which was developed by colleagues of mine, Andrea Daly and Judy McDonnell, who work from York University when we undertook this project on home care access in Ontario. And I think it still has significant relevance across the health and social care sector, including long-term care homes. And I'll describe the first part, and we'll see where the continuum goes when we intentionally or even unintentionally provide some welcoming environment. So intentionally disinviting really reflects overt forms of discrimination or exclusion that we might find or that LGBTQ plus people might find in their environments. And so that includes direct hostility or indirect hostility, refusal to treat or to support. And I've had many stories in my research where people would say, once my doctor found out, for example, that they didn't want to touch me anymore, or they refused to come into my room. Also ridicule, and this is something that we see quite often in long-term care homes in our own work, where somebody might be ridiculed, derogatory words used to describe them. There's a lack of response to experiences of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia when they occur. So somebody who might complain about having experienced ridicule or hostility and then nothing is done about it. And we could talk about how attitudes, sometimes ageist attitudes and excuses get made about why these occurrences cannot be directly responded to, something we'll talk about soon. When chosen families are unacknowledged, so our definitions of family are so closed that there's no room for chosen families to participate or to be acknowledged. When identities are denied, and we see that in the context of dementia care often, but in for older people in long-term care settings in general, where expressions of identity, gender expressions, people are dressed a certain way or discouraged from expressing themselves in a certain way, which is a kind of identity denial. There are attempts to block or change attitudes or identity expression of LGBTQ plus residents. So I guess I just said that. Those two are very much related and considered to be identity denial. So, two residents of long-term care of the same sex who, have an attraction to each other and hold hands, and they're discouraged from holding hands, or it's considered a problem that they're holding hands or entering into each other's rooms. And this will be a question for the end. In environments where we deny sexuality and sexual expression, we definitely are set to discriminate against LGBTQ plus and same-sex relationships. What does unintentionally disinviting mean? Unintentionally disinviting can be a kind of covert or hidden, not so clear, more difficult to name. And this can be in relation to invisibility. So that is often around programming. Like, do we have programming that includes LGBTQ plus people? Do we have visual markers, expressions of inclusion, explicit inclusion, like, for example, rainbow flags, or having an event that's related to the culture of the community? And this creates not only no opportunities for people to identify or develop relationships amongst each other when they're members of the community, but also tells them that it's not safe to be out, to have their identity recognized or known. Okay, that's that. Julien, anything to add? You can, please, if you want. And here is a quote. This is from a study that I'll be reporting on a little bit about inclusivity in long-term care homes, led by Dr. Tamara Sussman, of which I was a co-investigator. And this is a story recounted to us by a trans-identified chosen family member who said, "When I walked by the sitting area to get to my friend's room, all the residents were calling out insults to me. I said to myself, it's like being back in the schoolyard when I was a kid. It made me realize that the residents in long-term care also need sensitization." And in my own experience, very briefly, it's okay to leave the slide there. I have a friend who had a close friend, a trans woman who used to visit him in the long-term care home that he lives in. And then when she would leave, people would call out, a couple of residents would call out derogatory names to him when he walked down the hall. So he's the resident. When he approached the staff to address the issue, they laughed. They thought it was funny. Quite disturbing in today's environment. Okay, thank you, Julien. So long-term care and LGBTQ plus residents. So we know that, just some basic percentages. We know that 18 to 33% of older adults, 85 years and older, live in long-term care facilities. Actually, I believe there's an update to that. I think is as much as 42% at the current time. And we talked about numbers a little bit, right? And we don't have research that tells us the prevalence of LGBTQ plus older adults in long-term care. It is unknown, but if we assume that 10%, we know that there are approximately 2,000, a little over 2,000 long-term care homes in Canada as of 2021, and that's according to the Canadian Institutes for Health Information, and 198,000 beds. So if we imagine that 10%, it means that there's almost 20,000 LGBTQ plus residents of long-term care. So we say that we use the 10% because that's, in and around the average that's commonly used for the proportion of LGBTQ plus people in the population. But there is some evidence that there might be more representation in long-term care facilities of LGBTQ plus people because of some of the heightened risk factors, one of which is social isolation. And we spoke about that before. There are more people, LGBTQ plus people, that live alone than the general population. And that's particularly true for people 80 and over. Some of this cohort, this generation, may not have adult children, partners, or family to support them in the community. And that could be because they are disconnected from their families of origin. And many have limited financial resources. So the economic security or the economic precarity, of LGBTQ plus people is higher, more elevated, particularly the older population, because they were at risk, of course, as Julien described in the history, of losing their jobs, being unable to find work in particular sectors. And so this results in a kind of financial precarity, which could put them at increased risk for requiring residence in long-term care facilities. Okay. A note about dementia. So before I start, I just wanted to give a call out to the report that was recently released by EGAL Canada and the National Institutes of Aging on living with dementia in the LGBTQ plus community. I have the cover here on this slide. It really is a very worthwhile read, an important document on addressing the realities of living with dementia when you're LGBTQ plus, and also the exclusion of considerations of dementia that are experienced by this community and the need for change. So just to start, there are approximately, according to the Canadian Institutes for Health Information, about 431,000 people living with dementia, and that was in 2016. That was the latest data I could find. 39% of those live in care homes. Oh, this is where my statistic, the 42% of people 80 and over live in long-term care homes. So the older you get living with dementia, the rate of increase of living in long-term care increases. So if we think about 431,000 people, and again, we use that 10% number, then there are or could be approximately 43,000 LGBTQ plus people living, experiencing dementia in some form. 69% of residents of long-term care have dementia. And so it's really important for us, if we're creating intentionally inclusive environments for LGBTQ plus people, to really pay attention to this issue of dementia. So according to this report and some other research, there are significant risk factors that can be at play for the community in increasing the rate or likelihood of dementia. Social isolation, we talked about already. Economic precarity or financial precarity, we spoke about. But also there's the impact of stigma on long-term mental health and health practices within the community. And again, when we're talking about older people now, as Julien explained in that chronological arrow, people grew up and lived their young adult and adult lives at a time when the level of hostility and discrimination was very high in our society. It's not that it's gone away. We think we live in a much better society now because there are laws in place, but the social attitudes of people fall behind the changes to law and policy. And law and policy is not a guarantee. It's a right for the moment, but not a guarantee, because laws and policies can be changed. So we also have to be very careful about social attitudes and institutional policies. But people who are older now, who are in their 80s, have lived stigma across their entire lives. And this has an impact on their mental well-being and also potentially on their health practices. So for example, people have delayed help seeking when they have a medical problem for health issues, and so have chosen families to avoid discrimination. And that can lead to delayed diagnosis. And we know how important it is to have an early diagnosis to have proper treatment. And so LGBTQ plus people might experience delayed diagnosis and treatment. And because of discrimination, inappropriate or reduced care by health and social service professionals and organizations may also result. And that includes caregiver organizations as well as organizations serving older people. So we have to be careful about these increased risk factors that maybe it's, even though we don't know the number, it may not be 10%, it may be even higher. And some of the key issues to think about when thinking about LGBTQ plus people and dementia are things like behavioral changes. So people as a protective sign of resilience may have chosen not to disclose their identities over their life course, and that keeping their identities private is really important in the way they resist against discrimination and oppression. And we hear that a lot in my research, that people, if you ask them how they identify themselves, they say it's a private matter. My sexual orientation or my gender identity is a private matter, not for anybody. And with dementia, they might inadvertently begin sharing their identities without assessing the environment as to see whether it'll be supportive or not. They may fear forgetting, so they may have more anxiety around forgetting their identities or forgetting their coping mechanisms over time. And memory changes might put people back into traumatic time periods of their life. So they may have memory changes in which they they don't remember the recent past, right? But they remember the long past. And that time period long ago when they were younger was a time of increased hostility. So we have to be careful about how we respond to and understand these fears and these realities of LGBTQ plus people living with dementia. LGBTQ plus older people are less likely to engage in end-of-life planning or advanced directives. And again, that could be because of social isolation. Who do I talk to about this? Who do I trust to make decisions for me? And so people avoid making these kinds of decisions. And there's certainly a lot of research on this subject. And so not having advanced directives mean the healthcare system makes decisions for you, right? And if the long-term care setting doesn't recognize your chosen family or reach out to the LGBTQ community for help and support, then those decisions may be erasing their identities and their needs. And the over-regulating and policing of sexuality and gender identity as punitive to people with sexual and gender diversity can also have a really bad impact, as I discussed before, on people with dementia as well. Okay, thank you.
And maybe just one of the main challenges that we're facing when we navigate through seniors services is, as Shari said, like the fact that people tend to think, oh, it's a private matter. We don't need to know about their private life. And it's surprising because when you think about it, when you are not 2S LGBTQI+, you do disclose your sexual orientation and your gender identity pretty much every day, or at least once a week. So if it's private, it's only considered a private matter for members of the 2S LGBTQI+ community. So there is a double standard here.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you. I'm watching the time. How are we doing with the time, Julien?
It's not the timing is not showing on my notes right now, so I'm not sure, but I'll let you know later.
Okay, it's 10:49, so I will try to go through this research project a bit quickly because it's somewhat repetitive to what we're going to discuss about best practices afterwards. But just to call your attention to the fact that there is a study in Canada in which LGBTQ plus inclusivity in long-term care was undertaken. It was completed I'm trying to remember. It might have been 2016 or 17. And we published an article on this, which is tiny listed at the bottom, but we can certainly send Leah the information for that article. That kind of described initiatives to address inclusivity taken within Canadian long-term care homes in 3 provinces. And it was Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. And what we tried to do is to target long-term care homes that actually did something around inclusivity, showed promising practices, and to look at the gaps, challenges, and solutions regarding implementation of inclusive strategies in long-term care homes. Okay, I think we can just to say briefly, we use long-term care homes, but the definition of homes that we used for the study varied according to the provinces because, as you know, that language changes. So homes represent facilities that cater to residents with heavy care needs and are referred to provincially as long-term care homes in Ontario, residential care facilities in British Columbia, or Centre d'hébergement et de soins de longue durée, CHSLDs, in Quebec. Retirement homes were also included, and they represented facilities that cater to residents with lighter care needs and are referred to provincially as retirement homes in Ontario, assisted living facilities in British Columbia, and intermediate resources in Quebec. Okay. I wanted to mention, anyway, I'll skip that part, but I have the data on how many are private and public homes across the country. But I guess we could save that just for the purposes of time. So it's a small sample, but what we did is we looked online at promotional material that suggested there was inclusivity. And through snowballing, which is basically word of mouth, people would tell us about a particular home that has done something in a particular province. And in total, we spoke with 32 homes about their practices. And then we had a deliberation, a 2-day meeting aimed at identifying barriers, gaps, and solutions, which was made up of a sample of people who were advocates in the community, older adults themselves, service providers, and researchers. Okay, very briefly, most of the facilities that we identified were in Ontario. So good for Ontario for being the lead in creating and advertising that they are inclusive to the general public. Part of that is the amazing work of Toronto Long-Term Care Homes and Services, which had we have the slide with it a bit later, but that developed a project to increase long-term inclusivity in their long-term care homes and created a toolkit which everybody should have. I recommend it for all family councils represented here today. I think we could, oh, did I miss a slide? Oh, yes, I did. Sorry. So as we said already, most LGBTQ plus people are concerned they would be ostracized or rejected in long-term care if their identities were known. There's a lack of awareness and training among service providers in aging, which is well documented, although we do see evidence of more openness in general gerontological services like home and community care. And some guidelines emerging on steps have been developed, like at Fondation Emergence, as well as in Toronto Long-Term Care Homes and Services. So just very briefly, what did we learn? Next slide, please. Oh, next slide even. See, I didn't look up for my notes, so I didn't see where the slides were. Sorry, everybody. So this slide says that of the people that we did telephone interviews with, that most of the facilities were in Ontario. Way to go, Ontario. Half of the homes were nursing homes, long-term care homes, and half were in retirement homes. And a strong majority of the homes were within the mainstream sector, so services for the general population. But in Quebec, actually, we did some interviews with a couple of private facilities that were retirement homes that were built and run by the community itself, by the LGBTQ plus community itself. Okay, next slide. So what did we learn? What we learned is that staff training is the most frequent initiative that was undertaken. That's 22 out of 32 homes at about 69%. And 45% offer training to all staff. And this is really important. So not just the professional staff, but also the frontline staff and the administrative staff who interact with residents and their families. And I think this is really important. When we target training, we often target it to the nurses, the social workers, and we forget about the admin staff, the person who's answering phones at the desk, etc., welcomes people at the front. And also personal support workers can sometimes be left off the training agenda. LGBTQ themed programming was the second most frequent initiative at 44%, and most offer them at least once a year. Findings suggest that when they were educational or recreational programming, the results were positive, with some raised awareness among staff and other residents. A third of long-term care homes, that was 11 out of 32, that's 34%, developed advisory structures, either internal or external to the residents. So there was an advisory committee that had connections to the local community, or a small advisory committee at the long-term care home itself. However, less frequent was the use of permanent measures to communicate inclusivity. So through, like, for example, a charter of rights or symbols or adapted language, and we'll talk about that as a best practice, at only 25%, and outreach to the community also only 25%. So that means 8 of the 32 homes actually did outreach in the community. Okay, I think that is fine. That maybe one other point to suggest from this slide is that those that extended strategies to practices that were more visible to residents, like themed programming, recounted raised awareness among residents and comfort with self-disclosure among LGBTQ plus older adults. So that's an important point. Thank you. I think I'm done. Next slide. Oh, me again. So what can we do better? What can we do better? This is really important, I think, for us to spend some time on. And we have, I think, around 15 minutes to do so, so that's good. How can we make environments more intentionally inclusive for LGBTQ plus residents and their chosen families? And what role can family councils play in this? Okay, thank you. Next slide. Oh, here it is. So that's the cover of the Diversity Our Strength toolkit. Again, I really, really recommend that every long-term care home should have this toolkit at their disposal. Done by the Toronto Long-Term Care Homes and Services LGBTQ plus Advisory Committee and published in 2008. I'll be curious when we all see each other if how many people have actually seen this toolkit. Go ahead, Julien.
And yeah, another resource is the Aging Gifully program that I'm dedicated to. As Shari said, we offer training sessions for staff, advisory committee, and we also have a charter of the inclusion of LGBTQI plus communities for services and environments who are requesting our services in English or French, and that's offered throughout Canada.
Thank you. I think it's good to mention also, being that you're in Ontario, that Sherbourne Health Centre, there's Rainbow Health Ontario program at the Sherbourne Health Centre in Toronto, but they actually do work throughout the whole province. And if you know you're interested to have a training directly with and at the long-term care home itself, they would be a good resource for people to call for training. And of course, we are also available to provide training. Julien, you've done some training in other parts of the country as well, I know.
That's true.
Okay, so yeah, sorry. Okay, me.
I was just confirming.
Oh, confirming, great, thank you. So we're returning back to the inclusivity framework developed by Andrea Daly and Judy McDonnell as part of this project we did on home care access for LGBTQ plus people in Ontario. And so we see the other end of the continuum, the improving end, from intentionally uninviting, unintentionally uninviting, unintentional disinviting, intentionally disinviting, unintentionally disinviting, unintentionally inviting, and intentionally inviting. And we're hoping that everyone can move along this continuum to get to the place of intentionally inviting. Unintentionally inviting is when individuals are welcoming and open and create that atmosphere one-on-one with the resident or their family. And that's great. We don't undermine, that's really, really important. But it doesn't go far enough, that we have to create systemic change, which means intentionally inviting, creating an environment in which people feel comfortable, feel welcome, feel that they can disclose and be supported and respected. And all of the components along this framework can help lead us there. And we think of it like the P's. So people, places, practices, programs, policies, and processes. So it's kind of easier to remember, but I'll just touch briefly on some of the examples of what that might look like. For places, for the environment, does the residence, does the long-term care home have visual cues of acceptance and welcoming? That could be a rainbow flag, it could be relevant brochures, it could be representations of LGBTQ plus people and relationships in their promotional material, in the posters. That's the space. In terms of programs and services, do we adopt a client's definition of family? Do we ask, do you have a wife or a husband? Do we assume to call the wife or the husband in terms of a kind of a heterosexual normative relationship? Or do we ask, who is important to you? Who would you choose to accompany you, to make decisions with you? Who do you consider to be your family? And even use the word chosen family with people, because that'll be an important indicator that you know the language of the community. Is confidentiality and privacy respected? And remember, that could be quite awkward and difficult because we want to raise awareness, but we also don't want to expose people and out them, if we use that language, in the environment without their permission. Who would you like to know that you are gay, lesbian, trans, etc.? And to make sure to get permission from people when you put information in their file. Is there opportunities for alliance building with everybody? So that would be the kind of programs we offer that include everybody. During Pride Week, that's a really great time to have a festivity or activity, although we should do them all through the year, but a way to start where everybody's included and everybody can learn. But we also need specialized programs for LGBTQ plus member residents and their families. And I think we need to adapt assessment forms and the language that we use in assessment forms. So I know, Julien, you're going to be speaking to that afterwards. Policies can be like talk about and develop policies addressing sexuality, but including sexual and gender expression as part of those policies on sexuality. Create safe space and organizational support for employees, because oftentimes in the system as it is now, it's employees who self-identify as LGBTQ plus people that become champions of the environment. And they can also get burnt out or expose themselves to risk if not supported. Advertising, newsletters, reports, and the development of a non-discrimination statement that includes sexual and gender diversity becomes important. And finally, we can talk more about the leadership role of people, and that includes staff, but also family councils and resident leaders, resident groups who really have a really, really important place as leaders to build these opportunities in the system, to call out the system when there's discrimination, to demonstrate to chosen family that this is a place they can come with their concerns and complaints, and involving community as leaders to train and support.
Thank you, Shari. And we're going to get back to the good practices. But just before, we wanted to give you an overview of the attitudes that I am facing when I approach senior settings and senior services. Usually I'm going to have comments like, oh, thank you very much, but we do not have LGBTQ people among our residents. When it's like a residence with like 300 people, and the person telling that to me is the director who's been running this residence for the past 30 years. Well, maybe, if no one ever dared to mention they were LGBTQ plus even once, maybe that's a sign that, the environment is hostile without even you realizing it. So that's a very touchy thing to suggest to environments we work with, but it's a very common attitude. We also have attitudes like, oh, we treat everybody the same way. What happens in the bedroom is not our business. So that's the whole idea that this doesn't need to be known. This is a private matter. This is something that should something that happens in the bedroom only. That's actually very stigmatizing to have such attitudes, because if your first reaction is to reduce the topic to someone's sex life, you're not gonna be intentionally inviting for the person to speak up about who they are, because sex life is very private. And maybe you are all aware that sex life of senior citizen is probably like the biggest taboo in our society right now. What we have here is a residence family will complain. That's very disturbing, because sometimes I get the comment that, our customers are more the families than the residents. So this is an example of the level of mistreatment that we can find sometimes in senior environments. And last, we cannot do anything because other residents are comfortable. So the whole idea is an attitude of denial of sexual orientation or gender identity, when you pretend that it doesn't really exist, it's something private, it's not something that we should address. We consider this as a form of mistreatment. That's actually the case in Quebec, where denial of sexual orientation and gender identity is considered a form of mistreatment. Exactly. So let's stop here with the attitude to avoid, and maybe get back to the good practices that Shari started to introduce to you. So if we wanted to sum it up, the general idea is to be proactive in your demonstration that you are open to sexual and gender identity. So Shari gave a lot of example. It can be visual cues. It can be, having your staff trained about this topic. It can be having an activity for residents, to talk about sexual and gender diversity, celebrating Pride Week, May 17th. All of that are good things, like to break in the Shari's visual, like I call it like the vicious circle of invisibility. We don't see the 10% of LGBTQ plus seniors, so we don't see the need of, being more inclusive. And because we never do anything to show that we're inclusive, it's a signal for the 10% of LGBTQI plus that maybe it's not safe for them. Maybe they should avoid talking about it. So we are stuck in a vicious circle right now. Society has made a lot of progress in the inclusion of sexual and gender diversity. Nobody's denying that. But in some environments, such as senior environments, things didn't really evolve yet. Second good practice, it's more tricky, is to react to homophobic or transphobic behavior. And the idea here is not to condemn the person who was homophobe or transphobe. The idea is more to react for people who witnessed it. If you remain silent, like, you're going to validate whatever happened. So just, say that it made you feel uncomfortable, or if you are in a situation of authority, you can say, oh, this is against our policy, this is not welcome here. But it's really important to react in order to demonstrate that you are an ally of LGBTQI plus communities. Third good practice, and Shari already talked about it, do not assume that everybody is straight or cisgender. That means the opposite of being trans by default. And sometimes you can find that in the language that you're using. If you're asking, for example, to an older woman a question about her husband, do you live with your husband or do you live alone? Well, if she has a wife, you're not going to make her comfortable at all bringing up that her partner is a woman. So avoiding terms like husband, wives is always a good idea. Are you single? Are you sharing your life with someone else? This is a good way to leave the door open, because the idea here is like not to push people out of their safe zone and to push people to say that they're LGBTQ plus. That's not the idea at all. The idea is like to make the environment more welcoming and safer. So if people want to talk about it, and maybe they will at some point, at least with some people, you want to invite them to share that information with you, but without pushing them. Of course, it's a matter of safety for them. So they are going to decide whether or not it is safe for them to come out. Something more specific to the trans and non-binary communities is to always respect the gender identity of a person, no matter what's their sex assigned at birth. What matters is how they identify on the gender scale nowadays, and respecting their gender identity starts with respecting their pronouns. So he, she, they, whatever they express has to be respected, no matter their sex assigned at birth and no matter what it says on their official documents. Sometimes you don't make a transition through your official documents, or you haven't done it yet. It doesn't prevent you from being respected in your gender. A common question that I have about that is, sometimes, he, she, it's not super obvious, what we should use. My suggestion here is start with presenting yourself. Hi, I'm Julien. I use the he, him pronouns. What can I do for you today? By doing that, you should make the person comfortable by letting you know what pronouns you should use to address them. Number 5, and Shari already talked about it, it's so important to respect confidentiality. It's not because if the person tells you that they are 2S LGBTQI+, well, first of all, good job. If people say that information to you, it means that they feel safe with you. But it's really important to keep in mind that this can be a very sensitive information. Maybe the family is not aware. Maybe the children is not aware. Maybe they're not willing that other residents or other members of the community know. So it's always good to show them that you're aware that this can be tricky. So not only you're not going to disclose this information with someone else, but you can ask the person, oh, thank you so much for sharing that with me. Well, tell me, should this remain between you and I, or is the rest of the group aware? Just ask the person, what's their limit in sharing this information. And last but not least, treat chosen family as you would a family of origin. It's part of a culture. Sometimes we tend to limit the social circle of our seniors to their family only. Well, it's not true. They can have lovers, they can have friends, they can belong to several communities. So in your language and in the way you welcome their loved ones, just make sure there is no hierarchy between family of origin and their friends. It's up to the person to decide who are the important persons within their network.
So just to add quickly a point about community engagement, which is really important. And as you saw from that research study, not necessarily undertaken by long-term care homes. It's really, really important for communities to become involved in partnership with long-term care homes and with family councils in order to not only offer training, but also to provide information and resources and supports, volunteer opportunities in the home. So reaching out to the local community and finding out who the organizations are within that community can be a really important addition to complement to families of origin that are involved directly in the care of an individual loved one. And I think that advisory boards and committees can be a great way to look more structurally at the long-term care home and of the practices of that particular group or organization to improve intentional inclusivity. And one of the things I think that we often say, Julien and I, when we speak about these issues, is that the equity, diversity, and inclusion policies and processes are mandated by government for public sector services. And there are many organizations that, including, I believe, the Family Councils of Ontario, that begin a process of addressing EDI but they don't always think of LGBTQ people as a cultural group. And if we consider them as a cultural community or cultural communities, then we can more easily fit them into our current work that we're undertaking to address ethnic and cultural diversity within these EDI principles and processes. So we highly recommend that you think of this community or these communities as cultural communities as well. Here we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this great presentation, Shari and Julien. We've had a lot of interest and a lot of great questions. So I'll jump right in so we can get to as many as we can with our remaining time. Sam, I apologize if I cut you off. I do believe you're muted.
No, all good. Over to you. I was going to say thank you. And we've got a few questions that come in. So Leah, take it away.
Awesome. All right, our first question. Are there any immediate options LGBTQ plus residents and their chosen families can turn to if they continue to run into uncooperative healthcare professionals or have difficulty accessing documents on their medical history?
That's a hard question for a first question.
There are a few programs that exist that we talked about in the program, like the Aging Gay Fully, other resources that Shari talked about. Also, it's always a good option to reach out to your local LGBTQI plus groups, even though they might not always be so inclusive of seniors. That's another problem. Maybe Shari, you have other ideas?
Well, my first thing is a constraint because one of the constraints in the formal process of complaints, and I ran up to it with I was supported by Julien, this recent issue that I spoke to you about, my friend living in a long-term care residence who was called derogatory names when his trans identified friend would come and visit. And we sought, with Julien's help, a bit of an inquiry about going through a formal process, not so much to speak to the individual issue, but to encourage the long-term care sector to provide training. And we were told at the time that it's individual. We need the name of the individual. If we don't have the name of the individual, we need the name of the particular long-term care setting. And my friend, who was a resident there, did not want to complain because he felt, rightly so, that it would become obvious if they went to that particular residence who he was, and he did not want to make worse the situation. So I agree that, going the formal route through the complaint department can often be a real hindrance rather than a support to somebody experiencing discrimination at a home. That being said, that's where I think that more informal relationships. So number one, I think family councils, if they create inclusive environments for complaints, can play a very, very important role. Users or residents committees, if they're open and supportive, can play a very important role to protect the identity of the individual, but push the issue in terms of getting a response. Of course, it becomes important for the family councils and the users committees to educate themselves and become more respectful and appropriate and inclusive, and that may take some time. So then I agree with Julien, is to locate if it's possible, to locate the queer organization, the LGBTQ plus organization within the region to register the complaint and get some support. And as Julien mentioned, sometimes these organizations are not thinking about older people yet. Their seniors are not active members, or they haven't thought. There is ageism everywhere in society, which means there's ageism sometimes in the community. Again, the Sherbourne Health Centre and the Rainbow Health Ontario program really can provide support regionally. Accessing medical documents, medical history. I don't know if Sam or Leah know the situation or the process in Ontario. There is a process for gaining access to your medical history in Quebec that I know about. So excuse me for being from another province. Again, it's really hard for older people to access it because it's all online. So that's another deterrent for older people to gain access to that medical history. Do either of you know the answer of where to go in Ontario?
I'd have to look it up. I know there is a process, and if there is, if families or residents or patients are not getting the response they're looking for, it'd be to, usually there's a patient advocate, or there's also there's a patient ombudsman in Ontario as well. It's an office of last resort, but they do provide good feedback, even if it's not something their office can take on.
Okay, so maybe that would be something that we could share with everybody, you know, after the event is over. Thank you.
And there are two resources in Ontario that I know of. Now we talk about it. There's a Pride Senior Group in Ottawa, and there's also an organization for French-speaking Ontarians, which is called Franco Queer, and we work with them quite a lot, and they're pretty active on that topic.
Awesome. We'll be sure to look up some information and we can share it on our conference page so everybody has access to that. Our next question says, thank you for the timeline outlining the historical policy experiences of LGBTQ plus residents, families, and friends. What can we do to support those who come from different countries with different social policies regarding the LGBTQ plus community that live or work in long-term care?
So I think that's really important to recognize the diversity within the community, and I thank that individual for their question. We didn't speak, we spoke to the general, you know, issues for older adults, but didn't talk about the diversity within the community. And this is important, that the historical experiences of people who are immigrants to Canada or migrants to Canada, either as older people themselves or as employees of the organization, experience multiple forms of discrimination simultaneously in their lives. And so those processes of both identifying with a community and feeling connection or belonging within multiple communities, that might be their own cultural community, ethnic religious community, transnational community, and also the local LGBT community. So there's many aspects of intersectional forms of discrimination which will impact them over the life course. And we know that different countries internationally have had different policies, some more open, some more hostile towards LGBTQ plus people. So that should be part of our, again, good practice discussion with people about their identities, their histories, which requires more kind of engaged communication with individuals, which we know that staff don't always have time to sit and engage in the life histories and life stories of people or their families. But we think that that's an important way to build trust and to understand the person, and also give it back to the person again, or their chosen families, about how they identify and who they want to know. You know, I think that LGBTQ plus communities as volunteers can play important roles in that, but people may not be out to us, and we can't ignore sexual and gender diversity when we speak to cultural and ethnocultural diversity and immigration. In terms of employees, I mean, I think it's really important that we don't forget the employees in long-term care as an important, not only target of training, but also as members of the community themselves, who may feel also concerned about disclosing to other staff, and may also feel that double bind of trying to you know, keep their employment safe and their relationships with other staff members safe, while at the same time feel a sense of urgency and what's the right word, responsibility in supporting long-term care residents who are LGBTQ plus identified within the community. And we have to pay very careful attention, again, not to, like we say, oh, older people can't change, so we can't ask them to change. This is an ageist attitude. And it would be the same if we said, oh, they're from a certain cultural or religious community, they can't change, is a racist and discriminatory attitude. People can learn and can identify regardless of their religious or cultural upbringing, and also at later ages in life. Again, Julien said the way is not to like attack the person and say don't do this or punish them for that behavior, but to engage in an ongoing training and discussion on what inclusion looks like, and how we can include multiple communities, cultural communities in that inclusion. Maybe that's an indirect answer to the question. I don't know. Julien, do you have something more to add?
No, and maybe just one thing. People tend to consider that when people come from a different country, they suppose, since the countries can be homophobic, the person is going to be more homophobic and transphobic. And that's a common cliche that I have when I do training sessions, especially like people accusing, senior settings are not welcoming because of their staff is mostly immigrant. That's a cliche that I hear sometimes. And as Shari said, like some of those immigrants left their countries because they were LGBTQ plus. And it's also a population that reacts really well when we talk about intersectionality of discrimination. And that can be something more tricky to sometimes address with a white Canadian population. Yeah. So it's really interesting to take into account the bias that we all have sometimes, and they're often not so valid.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for a very thoughtful response. I think a lot of the times we think, what can we do now, or how can we fix this? And sometimes it's more about one thing or one action or one step in the right direction. And I hope that the folks watching have a takeaway there. I'm sure there are many. And if you missed it or you weren't taking notes, we're going to make sure that the information is definitely available to you. Sam, are you thinking we should wrap up, or do we have time for one more question?
Let's do one last question. I think there's a couple good ones in the queue there that I'd really like to pose.
Okay, great. So the next question will be, and you may have already covered some aspects of it, but since many LGBTQ plus residents in long-term care are less likely to be married, have children, or may be estranged from other relatives, do you have any suggestions on how they can begin to build safe and trustworthy connections from long-term care?
Well, that's a tough question, because it's from within their living environment. It's tricky. It can go well when the staff is trained, and the living environment is proactively welcoming of LGBTQI+. Maybe the person's gonna feel free coming out, and makes genuine connections from there. Of course, it's possible, but that's really going to rely on the proactivity of the environment to be welcoming of these communities.
Yeah. So from the Dr. Sussman's project that I was involved with, one of the things they found was when there were activities, so programs and activities, and I mentioned the easy one, which is events at Pride Week, but there was one from the Toronto Long-Term Care Homes and Services. One home had a movie a month, an LGBTQ kind of themed movie every month. And when what they found, or what Dr. Sussman's project found, is when these kinds of activities were inclusive of everybody, that over time it led to a kind of alliance building, in which you can have, we think of high schools of, queer straight alliances, but we can have those kinds of alliances in long-term care residents. And wouldn't that be great if we developed alliances in all of our long-term care homes, and so that people can develop friendships and where they're respected and honored for who they are with other residents in these kinds of alliance kind of organizations. But one thing that we said, I think that's really, really important, is more. We really need more engagement with the local community. This is essential, because then volunteers can come into the home, and we can create this openness with and connection to the communities and advertise that. Like every Wednesday, or we have volunteers from the local queer community coming in to run an activity or to meet with residents, etc. That this may also create the space for people to build connections, not necessarily within the home, but outside the home.
Those are some great ideas. And I think a lot of folks will feel excited and inspired to know that there is something you can do, an organization you can reach out to, or an idea you can pose to your long-term care leadership. So thank you both so much for your time, your presentation, and your very thoughtful answers. And I'm going to pass it over to Sam for closing remarks.
Again, just my sincere thank you, Julien and Shari, for sharing these important ideas, key learnings, and action items with us today. I think what really stood out to me as someone who tries to practice allyship is there are concrete suggestions here, and that family councils who have joined us today, really think about what you can do. Start by seeing what resources, groups, members of the community are around you. Reach out, start a conversation, build those connections. And I'd say not just so that you're asking something of someone, but what can you offer? Can you offer to help build connections, to walk together in a journey of improving your long-term care home and community? So really, I'd encourage our attendees to really think about that. We have so much that we should reflect on and consider about how to intentionally create inclusive spaces for LGBTQ plus residents and their chosen family. So I know, again, I've learned much from both of you today, that I'll be able to take back and use to inform FCO's work, helping caregivers, councils, and home staff across Ontario. And your point about intentionally including the LGBTQ plus community or communities in our EDI work is well taken. So I appreciate that as well. So again, attendees, please join me in thanking Shari and Julien for taking the time with us today. Up next at noon, we have Making a Long-Term Care Home a Home with Rebecca Priest. Until then, please use this time to take a wellness break, stretch, relax, get a glass of water or another cup of coffee, as the case may be. Do whatever you need to do to take care of your wellness. Until then, take care. We'll see you back at noon for another exceptional presentation in our June 2022 summer conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, we're about to do a tech test. Please ignore us. Please ignore the slides. It's going to ruin the surprise of Rebecca's fantastic presentation. I hope you're all distracted right now. So here is Rebecca.
I also hope you're distracted. Hi, Dinesh.
Welcome to StreamYard. This is how it's going to look like. This is your presentation. This is me disappearing, so you won't be able to hear me.
Okay.
So please try going through your slides and see if it works.
All right, let's try that. I'm having trouble getting them so that they don't show. So you can see right now my full screen, right?
Correct.
But not in slideshow presentation mode.
Nope.
Oh, I wish I was better with technology, Dinesh.
Well, we can try this. I'm going to remove your slide.
Okay.
I'm going to put the one I put up. And are you able to, I just want to see the writing is up there. Because if that's the case, then this can work. Yep, it looks like all the writing is there. Okay, so can you control this while it's on screen?
Can I?
Yeah.
How would I do it? Just normally?
Just hover over, forget your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Come to...
Let me make it...
Just hover over it. It might give you the option to move the slide right or left.
Okay. No.
I'm going to remove yours. Oh, no, I can't. So, what do you see on your screen right now?
So right now I see kind of like a sub-screen, smaller window with you and I, and then my slide,
right?
My lead slide, our chat.
Okay.
And then I can change that view by making it bigger, but I wouldn't be able to see the chat then, right?
I think so. So you can't control the slides on the main screen right now?
What if I stop sharing? That might help.
Yeah, that might.
Oh.
That was me. That was pressing right and left.
Yeah, me too. No.
Okay. All right, here's the next idea.
Okay.
I'm going to remove this, and then on the bottom where it says share, just upload your presentation. So click share, click slides, and then from your computer.
I'll have to just close it out quick. Okay. Did that work? Yes. Open. I like how it's like everyone can see and hear you.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Recording live.
I have a bang up session for you all in 10 minutes, 12 minutes.
All right. So here we go. I'm going to remove this. We're going to.
Oh, now I can.
Ta-da! Left and right should be able to control that.
That is brilliant. Okay.
So for the images with a big image and no words. Sorry, I'm going to disappear and then sort of either put you like that or whatever view you prefer. Those are the main options.
I like this view.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Let's look at this.
That was the last session was nice with that.
Okay, so you have full control, and so Kat will come on, introduce you, and then we'll do the thing, have a Q&A, and then simple, easy peasy.
Excellent. Thank you for your help. I really appreciate it.
We are going to disappear now.
Okay, so long.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cathleen Edwards, Education Manager at Family Councils Ontario, and it is my sincere, extreme pleasure to welcome you to today's session of our June 2022 virtual conference. Regroup, refocus, recharge. We have much to celebrate this month, with it being Seniors Month, Pride Month, National Indigenous History Month, and Family Council Week. I am grateful to be able to learn about these important celebrations and observances. But before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which I am coming to you from. I am based in Ajax, which is situated upon the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Mississauga, adjacent to the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island First Nations, and in the territory covered by the Williams Treaty. Family Councils Ontario was founded on land that is the traditional territory of nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As a remote team, we encourage our team members and service users and partners to reflect on colonialism's enduring legacy and engage in reconciliation meaningfully. We encourage everyone to visit nativeland.ca to learn more about the territory on which you and your home are situated. The work that non-Indigenous organizations and individuals need to do towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is a long-term journey, specific to each individual, and is constantly evolving for our organization. We welcome you to join us in this journey. To mark Seniors Month and Family Council Week, we're holding a series of education and networking sessions this month. And next week, we're holding our one-day conference featuring 3 guest speakers, structured networking opportunities, and lots of opportunities to connect with your peers. We invite you to join us for these incredible learning networking opportunities. Today is made possible because of our friends, specifically our monthly donors and our funding friends at Family Councils Ontario. Your regular monthly donations enable us to predict future revenues that we will use for special events and projects like this virtual conference. We couldn't do it without your help, and we extend our deepest gratitude. If you would like to know more about the Friends of Family Councils Ontario monthly giving program, please visit our website. But now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's guest, Rebecca Priest, for her presentation, Leadership Matters, Making Long-Term Care a Home. We'll explore the lessons learned in opening 2 homes that implemented the greenhouse model. Rebecca, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I am so grateful to be here with you all today. I just want to take a minute and share with you that I bring to our session today some of the elders who have gone before me. Those include my wise supervisors, most importantly, those who I have supported in living in real home. And I have earrings and a necklace in honor of my grandparents who taught me the value of relationships. And I think it's really important to carry them through into every space that I come into. So they join us today. I'm so happy and grateful to the Family Council of Ontario for hosting. So thank you so much. Just a little bit about me. I started working in long-term care in 2005 as a social worker. And in 2010, I took a foray into leadership and was able to have a really amazing experience alongside some clinicians, some elders, some wise leaders, and helped to open the first greenhouse homes that were situated in Rochester, New York, just across the lake from Ontario. So if anyone watching is up for a swim, I'm happy to meet you halfway. I know that was lame. I'm sorry. But anyways, I want to get going and share with you the great adventure we have ahead in creating real home. This is the first greenhouse home in Rochester, New York, and across the nation that was situated in a community standalone. It was 12 miles from the organization that it was a part of. And it was situated with a school bus that came through to drop off kids that were neighbors, a playground across the street, people who were going into retirement and wanted to downsize into a duplex home. And it's a really fantastic opportunity. I'm going to speak a little bit to this model today and to this experience, but I'm also going to talk about a broader context of providing real home. Because here's the scoop. real home looks different to every single person. And real home in long-term care can show up in many different ways, a multitude of ways, actually. This house, however, is one of the things I am most proud of in my career history to date. I expect many more great ventures ahead. And it is rooted in relationships, deep relationships that were designed from the ground up, from design of the physical structure to the operational design, really to maximize the power of the people who lived and worked inside of that house. So I want to share with you the power of deep knowing today. To date, this house, this is a long-term care organization, it's a nursing home, has been open for 10 years. It has superior results with recruitment and retention, and it is financially viable and successful while maintaining a mixed income clientele. So some people who are there have resources, others are supported by our government and the state's resources. These houses have had such great staffing success, it's difficult for me not to share that in this presentation. Many of the team have been there since we started together 12 years ago. And I, in helping to train and orient and onboard and get them up and running, have the great opportunity to continue to have deep relationships with many of these employees and some of the families too. I couldn't help but notice the lessons of this home. And since I was fortunate enough to take on leadership of this big organization, I had to bring some of those lessons back to this model. So this big old building, I want to share that with you. We kind of looked at what was working at that house and said, we can do this someplace else. Because as I said, house and real home look different to everyone, and they happen in all places. Real home is an essence of relationships. It's not a building, though the building does undeniably help. This big building supports 455 elders. And after 1 year of operational success in that first home that I showed you, I knew and our team knew that we could not continue to have such disparate results while we were serving elders in long-term care. So we worked really hard to bring the best of the houses to this building, which was landlocked, financially undersourced, and outdated. In order to do this, we really had to get some help. And we as an organization used the help of the Greenhouse Project, who I actually had the pleasure of joining on their team just a few weeks ago, right after they announced that they were partnering with the Pioneer Network. Pioneer Network supports a host of organizations that help places move from medical models of care to emotional or human or relationship-based models of care. I'm really excited to bring my operational experiences to improve outcomes for elders into this new role and share the learnings on a national and an international level with you all as well. The essence of a non-medical model for long-term care, really, it comes down to how do you listen to, how do you hear, and how do you make happen the support of elders living the lives that they desire in long-term care. So in order to do that, you also have to look at how do you listen to and really hear and support into action the experience of employees, especially direct carers, who support those who live in long-term care. The Greenhouse Project has been helping organizations shift from a medical model to an emotional or non-medical model of care for almost 20 years. It has really incredible data that I want to share with you that they've been collecting over that time in operation that have demonstrated the benefits for both clinical and staffing and satisfaction outcomes when this shift is done to include the systems and the processes that ensure that the traditional medical model sets in the background as really a secondary to the care model. In transparency, over the last couple of years, we have seen shifts in those open partners with COVID pandemic. So many of those organizations have, out of fear shifted back to a primarily medical model, and it has impacted their outcomes. However, even in this last year, and I'm going to show you data from 2021, those greenhouse outcomes with that commitment to real home and meaningful lives and deep relationships and fully partnered staff, which I believe is key, continue to show outcomes that are really superior to medical models in long-term care. So we show when you focus on those relational values, the clinical experience follows, the staffing experience follows, and we really start to make a difference in the experience of those, not just who live in long-term care, but the families of those people who live in long-term care and the employees that are working to support those people. You're doing a great job bearing with me. So today I really want to consider with you the role of leaders in creating a non-medical model of care in long-term care, the role of why this model works for retention, recruitment, and staffing success. And I hope to show you some good data around that and maybe bridge some good questions with you all. So as you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I know they'll get fielded to me. And then also, how do you do it? What are the imperatives for education, for training of staff, volunteers? How do families fit in? So I think we'll touch base on those three things: leadership, why it works, and what do we need to do in order to get it happening. Leadership. Let's talk about it for a minute. It's kind of a buzzword in our culture today. We like to pick on leaders. We like to question leaders. We like to elevate leaders and develop leaders, right? All sorts of things about leadership that we talk about. But in this model of care, in long-term care, shifting to a non-medical model, a non-hospital model of care, leadership is imperative. It is the essence of creating a sustainable shift because it comes from that crystal clear vision that a leader has that we can create real home and long-term care. The nuance is, if you really think about what's happening in long-term care across the globe, is that a good many of the former leaders of long-term care are phasing out or retiring, especially with pandemic fatigue. And then new leaders who in some ways are ill-equipped to kind of charter a new vision, or under-mentored, it would be a better way I would say of it. They really need support, and they need leadership beyond their role to create a sound vision. And this is where I think boards and support organizations like the Family Council come in as leaders of vision and of leaders of specific people who are supporting those ministries in your province. Leaders set the vision. Board leadership is vital, especially because of the shift of qualified and tenured leadership. I am excited, however, to see new leaders come into formal leadership roles in long-term care, because I think that they have fresh spirit and they have fresh lens, and they're eager and hungry for mentorship. When a clear vision presents, the leader also has to drive systems of change throughout their organization. That means evaluating their organizational policies and procedures, considering how they post for positions, considering how they interview for positions, and considering how they welcome people to their organization. Those are imperatives. And finally, leaders really, in this relational model or emotional model of care, leaders need to champion celebration. It's so easy to get lost in the day-to-day tasks and the day-to-day stories, and really forget to take stock in being human together. So leaders have to kind of raise that flag and tout that through. Let's think for a minute about who sets the vision for real home and what leadership looks like in a traditional model. I think you all see this in Ontario, but in a traditional model, only formal leaders hold the power. So people with titles, and they are expected to be leaders. Consider with me for a second, when that happens, how people like to go, well, if you're the leader, then it's not my job. I don't know, is this a universal symbol for not it? We get a lot of not it in traditional organizations. If you ask a question, they'll say, not my job, or you're going to have to speak to so-and-so, or that's the social worker's role, or that's the nurse manager's role, or that's the administrator's role. In traditional organizations, when this happens, it really frustrates the people who are asking questions. So that can include elders, can include family members. And guess who else gets frustrated when people say, that's not my job? The staff. They really get frustrated when they don't have the answers or they don't feel equipped to respond to the needs of the people who they're supporting. In traditional roles, there's a lot of punitive process, and fear is kind of the driver of behavior. So employee value is often based on, do they come to work and can they get their stuff done fast enough? I just want to put a stake in the ground here as someone who has had a lot of experience in leading long-term care. Timeliness of getting tasks done is not a driver of experience. It's a result of the employee experience. Coming to work is not a driver of quality. It's a result of the quality that that staff can impact in a home. And really, emotional and relational models of care, they take stock in that and they say, this is not the metric. This is not the input that we want to see the outcome of successful elders, successful retention and recruitment, successful quality. Those are metrics that come out of desperation, saying we really need people. And we do. We really do need people. So we need to create long-term care experiences that give people options and a place where they belong. And that's what this model is all about. When you have a team and a culture that recognizes the value of people, employees, elders, their families, and partnership, when you nurture them and you're focused on deep knowing who their grandparents are, why their grandparents are a part of their story, where they lived, what's important to them in their day-to-day, both staff and elders who live there and family members. That's when you get compassion and caring and a sense of dedication and expectation, not any other way. Command and control leadership, which is the model of traditional leadership, it's rooted in an outdated management practice where control and command was the best known science that we have. But we have new science. We have science in neuroscience. We have science in sociology and human behavior and psychology. And we have organizational design science that says there are far better ways to achieve results. We just have to get long-term care to wrap their brain around them. And that's where this model really kind of comes back to. Leaders in an emotional or relational model support employees in their relationships with their team. So that means the same teams work together day in and day out with the same elders. They have time to get to know new people who arrive. They have time to say farewell to those who passed on. And these leaders in a new model, in an emotional model of care, through their actions and through their desire to make decisions with the right people at the right place in their organization, are dedicated to hearing the perspective of all team members. So that means they're listening to elders, they're listening to carers, and they're listening to family members and nursing staff. There is a really kind of effort to go into hearing and listening and not skirting the experience of people into a place of, well, keep that over there for your personal life or keep that over there for another time. But really understanding that all of the factors of us as human come into the work that we do when we're human beings in long-term care. Each time a leader reinforces a human model or an emotional model of care, the model is strengthened. Each time employee efforts work collaboratively with their team to have an outcome that they wanted to do together, it's strengthened. And every time that leaders take away decisions or undermine decisions made by carers, the elders, and their team, every time those are kind of dismantled, this model, this relational model of care is also dismantled. Leaders have to believe that employees are good, smart, and they want to do a good job. When this belief drives decisions, yeah, mistakes will happen. It's okay. But it's not because of bad employees. It's because of a broken system, really a primarily medical model of system. So leaders have to really kind of come back and commit to the relationships. When they embrace relational or emotional models, they get results. Would you like to see some results that we get? I always love to see them. All right. I know everyone's talking about retention. Everyone's talking about recruitment. Everyone's talking about the staffing crisis. In this model of care, I love this. We call our direct carers or our support staff who do the direct care with the elders Shabazim. They are CNAs or a nursing aide in the States. And you can see that this is last year's data, 2021, during a pandemic. You can see that the main industry in the nation had 129% turnover in that direct care role. That's awful, right? It's also not all that different than it's been for the last 20 years. However, the greenhouse homes have had 33% turnover. That means 66 or 67% retention rate. It's really, really good. We want to do better, but it's really, really good. In RNs, you can see this has been a challenge, 141%. A lot of this comes down to there's a lot of options for RNs out there. There's a lot of options that pay differently, and there's a lot of options that have different flexibility than long-term care, if we look at the factors that make people change their mind. And again, this was in heavily pandemic, regulatory, and kind of scary times for people. The greenhouse metrics are half of the turnover that the national standard has had. For LPNs who support in med passes and kind of do a lot of treatment support, they have had 114% turnover nationally. In the greenhouse homes, only 41. Still too high. I get it. But again, this is really, really good evidence that a relational model of care makes a better experience. And the director of nursing role, which is a difficult to recruit for role, turns over nationally. We don't even have the data yet because they've been so busy trying to compile their COVID data. But we have a 36% turnover, 35.7% turnover in the greenhouse homes, far lower than the national experience. So it's exciting stuff. Satisfaction, again, I want to kind of breeze through this so we have lots of times for questions, but this is people who are highly satisfied. So top of the tier, I'm really happy I'm here, the most satisfied I can be in long-term care. Historically, across the nation in the United States, we see people in this 50s to 60s for this metric. In greenhouse, for families, it's 88%. In that blue is cultural transformation. So that's like the big organization I showed you early in. When you don't have a building or a house, but you're starting to do the operational and staffing changes to make a relational model or a emotional model happen. These are the results of satisfaction. So you see some really great correlatory evidence that the principles of real home, meaningful life, and fully partnered staff can make a difference, no matter what organization looks like, outdated or not. Elders, 88%, and staff, 75 and 73%. So these are much higher metrics than across our nation. People always ask, but is it safe? If it's not a medical model, then how do you take care of people? You take care of people by knowing what's important to people. And if they're uncomfortable and they're safe to tell you that, you can take better care of them. If they're scared to move and you know them and they trust you, you can help them move so their skin stays intact. So clinical outcomes follow the relationships. So this is, again, kind of a quick clinical outcomes slide, and I'll let you look at these on your own a little bit, but higher is better. So you're seeing here, I think this is the greenhouse one, right? Or the improved function. Oh, so this is overall function. So you do see in greenhouse homes, the function isn't that much improved compared to the federal stats, but we're also seeing people live a lot longer. So you get some of those data. Keep going here. On this one, I really wanted you to look at skin, UTIs, and antipsychotics. So all of those three factors are improved when you embrace an emotional model. Skin integrity is improved, antipsychotic use is far less, and UTIs. That comes directly from knowing people are thirsty and keeping them hydrated. So some of the clinical outcomes follow the model. I hope you're getting that from my share with you today. Finally, as we start to look at why does it work, let's talk about recruitment and retention and what the staff need. You wake up at the same time every day. Generally, you probably eat at the same time every day. Your biofunctions probably follow your patterns, and they're pretty predictable, right? I'm seeing you all nod your head. So if you think about what we do in traditional medical models of long-term care, everyone wakes up at the same time every day. So there's a huge frenzy of getting everyone up and out of bed. Everyone goes to breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the same times every day. Huge frenzy at mealtime. And then everyone has biofunctions resulting from that all at the same time. It doesn't make any sense in terms of workflow. But in a relational or an emotional model, the days and the rhythms are set by the people who live in that area. So you wake when you naturally wake. You eat when you naturally eat. You go to activities when you naturally go to activities. So the whole rhythm of the day flows around who you are and what your story is. It really kind of creates this customized experience for people in long-term care that's way more manageable. And it supports the staff success tremendously. Now, tasks in a medical model are often prioritized over desires and choices, right? So tasks come in waves, and that means a lot of people are waiting for the call bell to be answered, or waiting for their needs to be met. That doesn't even touch on inconsistent staffing and the lack of being seen that elders and the staff who take care of them often feel. In an emotional model with transformed culture, each elder's desires are taken into consideration. The care team can really consider what's the best way to set up our workflow, and what is the flexibility that we need, because flexibility with human beings is the name of the game. How do you create an operation that can move with people? When it can, it makes people happier. It uses the flow of their rhythms, not the organization's, and it supports the team in using tools to make sure that they have deep knowing and that they have the knowledge they need to create those rhythms with people. The result of that is staff feel like they can impact what they want to impact. It helps you to retain good employees, and it helps you to create process where relationships matter to those employees and those elders, which makes it more meaningful to stay, really. Similarly, employees who embrace this model start with getting to know their employees. Who are they? Can they bring their whole selves to work? Is it an inclusive environment that really honors each person's individual story? In a relational model, that is prioritized as much as the experience of the elder. All right, so how does it work? It's not just done by that carer and that elder and that family member system, but clinical support team members, the social workers, the activity specialists, the engagement specialists, dietitians, they really spend time growing and investing in the direct care staff. So instead of their primary focus being always on the elder and kind of this third party control where they have the power to get the right meal or they have the power to get the right whatever it is that person needs, that clinical support team really works on to make sure that the person who spends the most time with the elder has the power to get them what they need when they need it. Leadership is focused on removing barriers to that and really trying to create tools and resources that really view that operation with deep knowing. This helps to reduce compassion fatigue across the board, and it really makes people know that they're respected and valued. Both the elders, family members, both or all, family members, elders, and family and staff. All right. Here are the ways that you can really kind of focus an organization on an emotional model of care through education. Education will always start with, in an emotional model of care, examination of who I am, right? Who you are, who I am, examining the self. We invest in team members so that they can invest in others. If we don't start here, everything that we do kind of flows away. So that is where we always begin. Who am I? Why am I here? How can I fully welcome myself so that I can fully welcome others? Then education is clearly articulated across organizational levels, and it focuses on skill development, listening, crucial conversations, and facilitating growth. This is why when I moved all those best practices back to the big organization that was supporting 455 people, I knew I needed a partner. And it's why for me, I'm so lucky to join the greenhouse team because you need someone who can help you project manage, consider what key areas to start on first, external accountability, all those things. Then teams have to practice in safety together. So at Greenhouse, we use a tool called learning circles where everyone gets a chance to share. And then there's discussion. People can pass if they don't want to share, but we use those frequently for everyone, including elders, family members, and employees, so that there's really active calling of information and check-ins of where people's heads are at. Finally, those processes and those systems have to support relational connections. From the time you post an ad for an employee to the way you interview them in a way that honors who they are, facilitates their sharing of their story as they want to, and really just kind of nurtures a welcoming place for everyone. It has to be a customizable experience to meet each individual's needs, because guess what? You need something different than I do. And I'm probably going to have a different perspective on something than you are. And in a model that is emotionally based, that's okay. And we work on those things together and we share them together. We always have to come back to those focuses of, can we create real home? Would we do this in our home? How do we create meaningful life every single day through everything that we do? And how do we get fully partnered teams? That means the carer is not someone who responds to the demands of other people on the team, but they are a fully represented partner on the team. Above all, the expectation has to be to get to know and recreate a sense of connection and that one another are unequivocally valued. And that's what this relational model of long-term care does. And it does really get results. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation today. I wanted to open up. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to listen.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that incredible presentation. I know that caregiving and family council work can be stressful. As we invite today's attendees to regroup, recharge, I know the learnings and suggestions that you've provided and shared with us will help them to do just that. Specifically, I love how you said that a few things, the importance of the little decisions to reinforce the model, specifically the greenhouse model. So even the littlest, smallest decision that, the frontline staff are making can work to make or break that model continuing to grow and thrive within their home. And also the need to take time to celebrate, whether it's, the leadership. So the team leaders, right? The frontline team leaders, because I know at the Shabazim have a leader who works outside the kind of their frontline staff to mentor them. So celebrating within those care teams, celebrating within families and, who are part of those care teams, celebrating with the home. Those are all important takeaways, because I think we are so focused on the tasks and on the processes that we really don't celebrate the small things like, hey, you know what? They didn't want to eat breakfast right when it was breakfast, and they ate breakfast at 10 o'clock and they had a better day and were more alert because we provided that flexibility.
Yeah.
So we're going to transition into answering questions from attendees, but I do have a question because I'm a little bit familiar with the American system because my great aunt's living in Michigan, and I wish that we had known about greenhouse homes when they were making decisions about where she'd stay, because I do feel that it's a place where she and my great uncle would have thrived. But how are, I guess, the benefits and the way that, people fund their long-term care choices? How does that shape their options when it comes to greenhouse homes? Have you found that it's impacted their ability to opt for a greenhouse home because it has to be within their, I guess, their service provider or their
insurance reimbursability and things. So it's a little different the way people pay for services in the States than in Ontario. And I had the great opportunity of working with an organization in Parry Sound a few years ago. So I know just enough to be dangerous about how your organization works. But in the States, it's either you pay for everything or you've spent all your resources and you pay for nothing. It's not a super tenable system, but that's what it is right now. So the bigger issue that I found is when have you heard about greenhouse or any kind of emotional based model, right? Because people kind of conceptualize nursing homes that look like that second slide, right? A big kind of scary hospital look. And if you can find those, do they have room? Because their occupancy and their demand for them is so high that it's tricky to get in when the timing is needed for you and your family. So across the nation, there's over 150 open nursing home projects. There's others that are assisted living. and some that are even working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities or different strengths. And the biggest challenge with kind of establishing how funding works for those is how do you afford to build it in the States? But it costs as much or less than, and I found, quite frankly, a good amount less to operate a greenhouse home than it does to operate a medical model. So therefore, it costs less to live in one than it does to live in a traditional model. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. And I love that you talked about costs, because that's a question we have from the audience. So many long-term care homes would like to use transformative models, but don't have the support or resources. So do you have any creative suggestions for how homes can make small changes towards providing person-centered care within their long-term care home? So again, the bigger homes that can't, rearrange and make themselves into small homes because the facility already exists. But what are some ways that they can still try to embrace the greenhouse model within their traditional long-term care home?
I love that question. So one of the things I didn't share with you all is the way I really started to internalize and understand the greenhouse model, or even just an emotional based model of care for long-term care in general, is I happen to have a sister who has needs for long-term care, and she has my whole life, but she's always lived in a house. So I've really been able to watch her teach me. She's quite an elder, and she's taught me great lessons. And how do you procure a meaningful experience for someone who really needs a lot of medical support? And how do organizations then set themselves up to do that in a way that responds to the demand? So if you're in an organization where you don't have the resources to build a new building, you're in good company, because that's most of the organizations that support elders or any people with long-term care needs. It's just not a place where we dump a lot of money into, really since the 60s, right? Or late 50s. So I think we're on the precipice of hopefully seeing some shifts because of the outcomes, superior outcomes of this model for people. Hopefully governments will start to pay attention. So I do think there's some opportunity there. But if you can't, it's really quite a simple thing. I say that it's not simple. It's simple if you're a leader and you have a leadership mentality that believes in human beings. You start by interviewing staff differently and posting for staff differently. If you have employees who have musical talent, you say, hey, are you willing to share that with the elders who live here? Because I'd sure love it if you would play your guitar, your violin, or you start to identify like who people are collectively. That's the first step, is really figure out how to deep dive, get to know people. The other thing, and there's some great tools out there, a lot of free ones. If you look at the Pioneer Network, you can access some artifact. One great tool is called Artifacts of Culture Change. There's another tool that really focuses on becoming well known. And again, these are out there kind of free and accessible for people on the internet. The next thing I would really propose that you do is start to think about areas where choice is being eroded in your organization. So is choice being eroded around access to food? If so, make that a quality initiative, because we all have them. And instead of making your initiative impact weight loss, right? Make your initiative a strengths-based initiative to say, make food accessible 24/7, and then work towards that quality initiative with your team. And I think you can frame most of your quality initiatives, and I'm really happy to talk with anybody about this, in a long-term care model through a lens of creating real home or creating a relational experience. So I'll give you another example. I gave you food, which is an easy one. Can people wake up at the time that they want? I would focus this one through expressions of unmet need, or behaviors, we like to call them sometimes in the industry. I hate that word, but nonetheless. So if people are expressing unmet need and you change the way that you do your morning, make that your quality initiative. Say, can we be flexible in the morning? You may start to see, I suspect you will, that people have rest patterns that shift. And if you honor those, you'll probably see less expressions of unmet need, because people won't be as darn cranky. Does that help?
I love that you mentioned, flexibility, and you also spoke about, the shift from being task focused to resident focused, and really understanding what is their need in the moment, or what is it that this person needs as I'm providing care to them, which I love hearing that about, because that was one thing my start was in long-term care frontline, and you struggle with taking the time to pause because you are so task focused. I'm interested. You spoke about quality improvement, and I know our most recent Fixing Long-Term Care Act actually has some significant changes when it comes to quality improvement. So residents and families are now part of committees who are going to be having conversations when it comes to the quality improvement surveys every year. So what are some tips you might offer to families who are going to be embarking as part of this committee that they can bring in about quality improvement to raise a more person-centered and non-medical model approach in these conversations about quality improvement?
Boy, I know there's a lot of families that might be listening to this, and as a family member of someone who lives in long-term care, I want to tell you not to forget that you're a leader. So when we think about leadership, it is not associated with role. It is associated with influence, and family members are such a huge influence. And I do think we can influence positively, especially when we partner alongside organizations. I really do believe most organizations are trying to do a great job. It sometimes doesn't come out that way. But so as family, if you start there, just like I asked organizations to start with, people are smart and they want it in good and they want to do a good job, come into it with thinking organizational staff are smart, they're good, and they want to do a good job. If you come with that lens, then they're going to feel like, okay, we can work alongside. And I would really encourage families to bring some of the data and say, look, I've been looking at these emotional or relational models of care, and they have incredible quality data. Could we do a trial of one of these? Could we look at, again, access to food? Could we look at rhythms of the day to see if it impacts our antipsychotics or our behavioral expressions or our falls? Could we impact staff retention if we start to cultivate kind of a forum for staff to express themselves beyond just being carers? And I hate to say just being, because man, carers are amazing, but beyond being carers in that role, can we give them broader roles, right? So if you as a family member bring some data and say, what if we tried this? And that's a great suggestion for a family member too, is could we try something like for 6 months together and help the organization decide, yep, we're going to try it. What are we going to try? And then what are the things that we're going to do to try this? So get the commitment for the general philosophy and then help them think through some specific tasks that might help in order to achieve that result. That's a big ask for family, but I believe families are smart and can do it.
Well, and I really like that you framed it in the sense that families really are those partners in care. And so when you're having these conversations about quality improvement and implementing a change, just having that, understanding of what are you committing to do and what are you going back to that commitment. So as things get tough, as things get challenging, because it will be, if you're going to try and change something and things have always been done that way, you're going to have that resistance, but having something written down where you can go back to, this is what we pledged to do. This is what we've committed to do and why we've committed to do it. I think it will really help, keep you motivated on what is it you're trying to accomplish. So we have a question, and it is focused on intergenerational programming. So it's gaining more attention, and there are many fields that have seen the value in connecting groups from different age groups for activities and programming. Do you think more homes should consider this as they begin brainstorming relational models of care and looking into greenhouse model?
Yeah, I do. I think sometimes it's tricky for those elders who are in the model of care, the existing model, to get their brains there. So some things that I heard when I was operating is, I really like being surrounded by people who look like me, right? That's very human. Or, I left the grandkids for this a while ago, so I'm not interested in that. So one of the tips I have for it, but that said, your point is so solvent, is that intergenerational experiences are paramount to what I would call meaningful life, right? That greenhouse value of meaningful life. They create a little spontaneity because kids say the darndest things. And teenagers really need mentors and leaders, and long-term care is full of them. Where I would push is to really cross that boundary between it's the elders who need intergenerational experiences, and I would say it's the system that needs intergenerational experiences. So I think those staff, those carers, need partnerships with older people and maybe even with young people too. So you have to figure out a way as you start to plan some kind of intervention with intergenerational activity to really engage those employees so that they get the benefit of knowing diverse populations too. I had some experiences with a preschool who hosted a music program for grandparents, parents, and kids, preschoolers. And it was awesome because what they did was we had a music therapist run it. They came together and they created music together. And then what they would do is shift up partners. Once they kind of gained some camaraderie over a few weeks of working together, they shifted up partners. So they got to know people outside their own family units, and staff were a part of this too. And I thought that was a really successful way of starting small, once a week, half an hour, you're doing something fun. And it was super informal. It was, let's listen to some music. Share stories about music 1 week. 1 week it was let's start writing a song. The next week it was let's share our songs. So yeah, I think there's great opportunity for really meaningful engagement through intergenerational activity.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, so are there greenhouse homes that do have on-site daycares for staff or for family who are visiting? Because I do know, so if there's someone like myself, I have a 5-year-old daughter. So if I was going to go visit, my loved one to provide care, my daughter's great, but can also be very distracting. So have there been greenhouse homes that have implemented having a daycare on site or childcare on site so that way staff and families can kind of benefit from not having that barrier to getting involved in the community?
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. None that I know of have on-site daycares or like drop-in centers. Although I think that that's a really novel idea because it can be really hard to have a meaningful visit when you're focused on like where your little kid's going and what they're getting into. I'm 100% with you there. Yeah. That said, many greenhouse models have built-in operational policies and procedures that support their employees, bringing their staff to work with them. When the situation arises that it's needed. Because it's a house, it's kind of like if you went to work supporting a neighbor cleaning their house, like you would say, hey, I got my kid, my daycare didn't work out, can I bring them? And your neighbor would be like, yeah, bring them over and we'll bake cookies while you clean the house or whatever, right? Whatever it is. So a lot of organizations have tried to figure out ways to be really flexible and welcome staff's children. So I bet there's some opportunities for creativity around how to welcome family members in a more meaningful way too. I think that's a great insight. It's also not as scary to go visit a loved one when you live in a greenhouse home because it kind of feels like you're going to grandma's house or grandpa's house. Or the experience of that elder's house. So it feels a lot more comfortable to kind of go and hang out, and the other 9 people who live in the house. So it's not as intimidating in that model.
Now, within greenhouse homes, are there opportunities for each of the smaller homes to interact together in one big group like you would typically have in a more traditional long-term care home?
Sure. In some places, so there are some organizations that have built, like we built 2 houses. So it was 10 elders in each house and they had a shared backyard. So oftentimes we would have like picnics or we'd have, if we wanted to have, a musician come, we would do that in the backyard. Or there was a community center just next door where we could book the community center, which is kind of what you would do in your real house, right? If you were going to get a bunch of people together, you might say, oh, we're not going to do it here. We're going to go do it in that community center. The pleasure with that is we could invite the community around it, the neighbors, if you will. We also were members of the local YMCA, so we would go exercise there and use their pool because it's all handicap accessible. So bringing people who live with dementia or have physical care needs back into the community so that they can reconnect with those real community ties. Then there are organizations who have like 22 houses all together. So they've got all 220 of their people supported in 10-person homes throughout their organization. Those organizations do some big activities, but most of the meaningful stuff happens in the house. Most of the meaningful activities happens in the house or in the backyard.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, it's nice to know they have these opportunities and flexibility to do things in smaller groups, but also to get together as that larger micro community of that long-term care home community.
Sure.
When it comes to care planning, so you mentioned that you want the frontline staff to take care of people by knowing what's important to them. So when it comes to the care plan, the more formalized care plan, do you have any suggestions for how families and residents can better integrate the relational, emotional aspects of their care that will make a difference in their experience while still keeping in mind staff time and availability?
Oh man. Well, this is my favorite thing about care planning through my experience in traditional organizations, and we're still working on this. I often see first the doctor will go in and get a history and, skin check and all this, ask you a million questions. They'll probably ask some great personal questions too, because they have to build rapport. Then the social worker will go in and ask a million history questions and maybe find a little bit more information. Then the activities person will go in and find out what they're interested in and rehash all the questions that the doctor and the social worker have already asked. Then the nurse goes in because she's got to get her version of the history. And the last person in is the direct carer. I propose that the better model would be if the first person goes in is someone who is coached by that clinical support team to get a comprehensive history, spend some time getting to know that elder, maybe even supporting a physician in their assessment, because it's helpful to have someone who moves in, and use staff in a way that allows carers to have that flexibility of spending an hour and a half or so to welcome new people into the organization, because that denotes value to their role that often is undermined. And it also kind of speeds up the learning curve of how that carer partners with that person, and you're going to get a better satisfaction. Listen, so many people in long-term care love their social worker, love their dietitian, love their activities staff, like some of their care partners. But here's the truth. If they have good relationships with those carers and those care partners, their experience in your organization will be satisfactory, and they will get their needs met, and the people will know when something's not right, because those are the people who are there all the time. So I propose that you really commit to staffing that way. And I think part of our retention and recruitment issue is that we have not historically done that. And that really makes that job not nearly as meaningful.
I like that idea of bringing the front line, person who's going to be providing the direct care in that process of getting to know the resident right from the get-go. I was part of that chain of, I was a rec person going in and asking those questions, probably the same questions, even though I would be smart enough to go and check the care plan and get information in advance of going in so I wouldn't duplicate. You still feel like, families would tell you, you're like the fifth person who's asked this to me. It's a very overwhelming transition. So I like that approach. So hopefully it will make the process of becoming a resident and part of that community a little bit easier on both the resident and their family, and then on the staff, because then they'll have that, built-in relationship.
Yeah. And think about from a carer standpoint, like a CNA or a Shabazima direct support staff, of the power it denotes to their role when they get to share the information to the social work dietitian. You can have a welcome rounds where everyone collects it at the same time. And it really kind of just makes the process a lot less cumbersome for all involved.
I love that simple switch in how things are working, really to empower those frontline staff who do make the most impact, because they're the ones who are delivering the direct care, not so much, the nurse, the director of nursing, and all those people who might be making more of the care plans and telling the frontline staff what to do. It's kind of nice that they get to have a say. Here's the information, and hopefully have the conversation about, when creating that care plan, what does that frontline Shabazim think would work best for the resident?
Yeah.
So last question before we wrap up. We know that a lot of transformation and change is happening in long-term care, and it comes from policy decision. Do you have any recommendations for how long-term care organizations, families, and staff can share these insights effectively with the policymakers?
That's a loaded question, isn't it? Yes, I think you're spot on. I think there are a lot of policy changes coming. I think people are trying to figure out what policy changes will make the biggest impact, and what can we do in order to kind of shape the next iteration of long-term care, because we know that it needs to change. So I think one of the most important things that you can do is regularly communicate with your local policymakers and then ask them, who else should I talk to about this issue? And I really value sharing stories. Again, as a lifelong advocate, because of the gift of having my sister around, knowing those partners, both locally and then kind of at a mid-level of government, who have then facilitated and said, hey, we'd like to have you, Rebecca, share a story here, or could you get this relationship going? Just like emotional models of care, it starts with real relationships. Most politicians come into power hoping to make a difference. So if we share stories of how we believe policy could change to make a difference, either through funding new building development, through a universal direct care certification process so that people can literally move from place to place and still have the same certifications, through making a mandatory culture change or person-directed component to certification. Those are 3 policy efforts that I think would be really impactful. And if we make those recommendations and keep them succinct and clear and show them and share a story of why it would make a difference to you, I think that's where we start to shape how policymakers see their regulations coming into operations.
That is amazing and timely. I love that you made those suggestions because I know there's a lot of transformation happening within Ontario. So family members and, staff, just, Greenhouse have done a lot of research, and I know that they did one during COVID-19 looking at how their more small home designs fared compared to the traditional builds when it came to outbreaks, but also just the information that Rebecca shared in her presentation. Those are all, really good information. Politicians really like numbers and facts. So when you're having those conversations, use the presentations, visit those resources that Rebecca pointed out, because they're really going to help you in your case for advocating for change in policy and providing some information to support those policy decisions.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Rebecca, for answering these important questions. I really enjoyed the session. I heard about the Greenhouse Project. I read articles about it in February of 2020 before COVID happened. And then I attended a ton of webinars about the Greenhouse model throughout the pandemic. As we come to a close for today, I want to share on behalf of Family Council and all of our attendees our appreciation for you sharing your passion, wisdom, and insights about the Greenhouse model and how it can be implemented within long-term care and really help to make the home a home-like environment for residents, as well as for those who are, living and working in part of the community. We all have much to reflect on and consider in how we respond to the stressful events and enhance our that's not for this presentation, but that's okay. We all have a lot to think about when it comes to implementing culture change and transformation within a long-term care home. And, even just thinking about the impact of the simple, small decisions or celebrating those successes. To those who tuned in today, I hope to see you at our next session on June 13th with Dr. Samir Sinha, who will be discussing the future of long-term care. And until then, thank you for joining us today, and be well and stay safe. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.